Ampitu Washte. Good day, everyone. Welcome to the third of 5 different public meetings that we are having about our draft impaired waters list for this season. Like Hannah mentioned, my name is Leya Charles. I'm the Water Assessment and Impaired Waters List Coordinator for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And today we're going to be focusing in on the Southeast region and the assessments that we have done there. There have been some presentations already this week that you can check out on our website. The recordings are there, and we'll talk more about how to find those at the end. So the Clean Water Act is a federal rule from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And the Clean Water Act requires states and tribal nations with treatment as a state to develop standards to protect our designated uses, right? The designated uses being the goals for our water bodies. And then the Act also requires us to develop a list of waters that don't meet those standards. And that's where we're here to talk about today, is the impaired waters list. Now, that's definitely not all of what the Clean Water Act requires us to do. There are a lot of requirements for states and for Minnesota of things that we do to protect and restore our waters, but this is just a piece of it. And the Clean Water Act was established in 1972, and so I wanted to share a fun fact that the Pollution Control Agency was actually established 5 years before the Clean Water Act, which I think goes to show how deeply Minnesotans care about protecting and restoring our waters. So the impaired waters list, as we're here to talk about, comes out every 2 years as that requirement with the Clean Water Act. And that's pretty frequent as we are doing our evaluations and our assessments of our waters in Minnesota and making updates to the list. So the list is cumulative, which is important to note. So anything that had been listed, from the 2 years ago, from the 2022 list, is still on the list unless we have had new data that has shown that, it is now meeting that water quality standard. It is now meeting that designated use, and then we might delist it. So currently, we have over 6,000 different impairments on the list, over almost 3,000 water bodies. When you're looking at those numbers, just remember that you can have one surface water body, as we're talking about here today, one lake, one stream, one wetland. It can be impaired for multiple different pollutants. So that's why you're seeing, when you're looking at that beautiful, wonderful spreadsheet that is the impaired waters list, and you're scrolling and seeing, over 6,000 impairments, but there's only, 2,798 water bodies that are impaired. So let's talk a little bit more about the designated uses. Go to the next slide there. So designated uses, you'll also hear us refer to them as beneficial uses. Same thing. So those are the uses or the goals that we want to meet in our water. And here is listed out a few of what those uses or goals are, right? And so you can have a water body, a lake, a stream, a wetland that has multiple uses associated with it. The standards that we have set that protect our fish and our bug communities and our critters in the water are going to be different than the standards that might protect humans and for human health. And so you can have both of those designated uses assigned to one water body. We share the use of that water body, right? So here today, we're really focusing in on our Southeast assessments and focusing on the aquatic recreation and the aquatic life uses. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the others, but mainly that's where we're focusing today. And then we also have some uses that relate to human health, right? And we'll talk more about those in a moment that we do in our statewide assessments. So aquatic consumption, wanting low pollutant levels for the bioaccumulates that happen in fish, and then also, our standard for wild rice. So those are also designated uses we have on water bodies. So let's talk a bit about the assessments that feed into the impaired waters list, right? So starting in 2010, with the establishment of the Clean Water Fund, we established at the Pollution Control Agency a watershed approach. So we have 80 different watersheds within Minnesota, and every 2 years we're rotating through and picking out a few of those watersheds that we're looking in deeply and assessing that aquatic life and that aquatic recreation use. So within a 10-year cycle, we'll have gone through the entire state and looked at and assessed all of those watersheds. And we've already done that once. And so we're actually in our second cycle of looking through these watersheds again. And if you want to just click again, there'll be a couple pop-ups that will happen. There we go. So I have circled here, these are the watersheds in this list cycle in these last 2 years that we have assessed. So we've already had our public meetings about some of those greater Minnesota areas, and now we're here today chatting about the Mississippi River Winona and Mississippi River La Crescent watersheds. So that is our watershed approach for those. And then every 2 years, in alignment with the list, we also do a statewide sweep for toxic pollutants, things that affect human health, right? So mercury or PFAS, things like that in fish tissue. And so we're doing those every 2 years. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, but most of those are going to be focused on our statewide meetings that we're going to be having. There's one tomorrow and there's one next Tuesday. We'll talk about those at the end of the presentation. So here we have a summary table. When you pop open on our Impaired Waters List website and you click over to the next tabs, there's a summary tab. And there's this pie chart, right? Which is just one representation of how we can look at the list. But I wanted to mention this here today in alignment with, a quarter of the list being mercury impairments, and mercury being an air pollutant that gets into our water through precipitation, dry deposition. And the majority of our mercury pollutants on the list already are under our statewide TMDL. Our TMDL being, we'll talk about more about TMDLs later as we go along, but basically the calculation or the pollution budget for a water body. And when we have met all of the goals for our mercury TMDL, 73% of those waters will end up meeting the goals under our TMDL. So I wanted to point that out as we go along, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. Okay, so let's dive into our 2 different watersheds that we're going to talk about here today in Southeast. So we're focusing in, as I mentioned, the aquatic recreation and aquatic life designated beneficial uses. We also don't have that many new impairments that we're seeing this time around as we're doing these assessments. Like I mentioned, we have gone through all of the state already and done some pretty thorough assessments, and we're going back for a second time to look at and evaluate changes. And so we're seeing a lot less. It's important to note that it's just as good and encouraging to be keeping waters off the list as it is to be taking them off the list as we have new data to show delistings, right? So in these 2 particular watersheds, we actually don't have any new aquatic recreation impairments that we're seeing. As I mentioned, it's cumulative, so we still have some from last time around. And we're seeing a couple new things for aquatic life. A couple new total suspended solids. So, that the solids that are in the water column that might make it cloudy. And then some fish and some bug impairments. And when we talk about fish and bug impairments, that's about the diversity of species that we would expect to see in that water body. Those for aquatic life doesn't mean that you can't eat those fish or whatnot. That would be the consumption. Next slide. So here's just a couple as we went through and talked about statewide impairments that we're seeing in these 2 particular watersheds. So we'll touch a little bit on these today, but if you want to know more deeply about them, we will be talking more in our statewide assessment meetings, like I mentioned. So We'll dive into these two particular watersheds and really get into some of the nitty-gritty on like, okay, what are we actually seeing? Which water bodies are we actually seeing in these watersheds as new impairments? So this chart, you can grab a screenshot of it if you like, is all of the new impairments that we're seeing in this draft 2024 list. And so we're going to go through each watershed and each one so we can talk in detail. So if you want to pop over to the map. The thing I want to note about this map before we dive in is that all the maps that you'll see here are showing the cumulative list. So when you're looking at, the red that's showing impaired, that's not, oh, we found all these new impairments this time around. That is that cumulative. As well for those purple delistings and those green showing waters that we have assessed and looked at, but that are meeting their beneficial uses. So I'm going to pass it over to our project manager of the Winona and La Crescent area, Emily, and she's going to talk a little more about these.
Thank you, Leah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Zanone. As Leah mentioned, I am a watershed project manager for the Miss River Winona and Miss River La Crescent watersheds based out of Rochester. I'm going to start by talking about some of the stream segments proposed for impairment in the upper headwaters of the Whitewater. So Corinne, if you wouldn't mind just clicking once more to show, there we go. So we're going to start in the North Fork of the Whitewater River on the upper left-hand part of your screen. We have the upmost, or I should say most upstream segment of the North Fork Whitewater proposed for being listed for bugs. This is a new stream segment that came from splitting a larger stream segment because we have some really interesting dynamics in this part of the North Fork Whitewater where it's warm water, then changes to cold water, and then back to warm water. And our bug and fish standards change depending on whether our waters are warm or cold. So this stream segment, the most upstream, is a warm water segment, and it's newly listed for bugs. Then we go down to the next downstream segment of the North Fork Whitewater where it turns to cold water. So we assessed our fish and our bugs against that cold water standard and found that they are not meeting those more stringent cold water standards. So that is the reason for the fish and the bug and the sediment listings. I need to add that too for the next downstream segment of the North Fork Whitewater. The last segment of the North Fork Whitewater is that second black circle that you're going to see just to the right of the arrow. That's the next segment of the North Fork. It is back to cold water. This was not assessed originally in our first cycle of assessment. It was deferred for some reasons, and so when we finally assessed it in our cycle 2 assessment, we found that sediment is an issue for this segment. This doesn't come to a surprise for those of us who know this area of the North Fork Whitewater. We know that sediment is an issue, so it is it's agreeing with the issues that we already know are a problem in this area. So that will do it for the Whitewater. Let's move just north to Wabasha County where we have Gorman Creek. This stream section is newly impaired for fish. We found in our investigations that there are barriers that are limiting fish movement on this section of Gorman Creek. And we have also found through our water quality monitoring that we're having some problems with oxygen. So MPCA is further investigating this stream segment through what we call our stressor identification process so that we can better understand some of the pollution dynamics that are happening in Gorman Creek so we can improve, hopefully, those fish issues. So this is the new fish listing for Gorman Creek. Lastly, we're going to move down before I transition back to Leya to the Mississippi River La Crescent watershed where we'll talk a little bit about Pine Creek in the lower right-hand part of your screen. So we have a segment of Pine Creek that has a new listing for sediment. Now, this is an interesting situation because we saw this impairment coming back in cycle 1, but we did not add it to the list. We did, however, say, you know what, we're going to plan ahead for the future and we're going to write a sediment TMDL for Pine Creek so that we can just kind of keep this ball rolling and address this impairment. And so a TMDL has been written for Pine Creek for total suspended sediment, but we're finally adding that TSS listing to the impaired waters list. So that is the overview of the new impairments for the Mississippi River, Winona, and the Crescent watersheds, and we can move forward.
Great, thanks, Emily. So if you want to pop back over to the map, Corinne. Thank you. So the last thing to talk about in these two watersheds is Winona Lake. As I prefaced for you already, talking about mercury, so Winona Lake is split into two different chunks of how we look at it for assessments. So when you're looking at that wonderful spreadsheet, you see, oh, there's two new mercury listings. Well, they're both for Winona Lake. And those already are under our statewide TMDL. As I mentioned, a TMDL being, kind of the pollution budget for a water body. And when we meet all of those goals for the TMDL, we would expect to see this be delisted. So that is new. That is regarding mercury in fish tissue. So now let's pop over to the next slide and chat a little about what that means. Well, the Minnesota Department of Health has some state guidelines for eating fish that are in waters where we are seeing some high levels of mercury in fish tissue. So you can go on the Minnesota Department of Health website and find those state guidelines. Specifically in this area in Southeast, there are several lakes with some specific fish advisories, so I wanted to point those out here. But in general, you will find all of that information on the Department of Health website. So we are here today to talk about impaired waters and not as much about eating fish. So they will know the most details about that. I am not the expert in that. All right, so we have in this region of Southeast, if you want to pop over to the next slide there, some other areas of Southeast Minnesota that as we did those statewide assessments, as I mentioned before, if we think back to those slides with designated uses, our statewide assessments are for sulfate and for mercury in fish tissue. And so that's why we wanted to check in on some of these as well. So in the Winnebago River watershed, we did not assess this year for aquatic life and aquatic recreation. So that's why we're only talking about here just this one. Bear Lake is considered a water used for production of wild rice. And so we did an assessment. We had some data on it regarding sulfate and found that there are some higher than the standard sulfate levels for Bear Lake. So that is new this year in the Winnebago River watershed. And then next up, we have the Cannon River watershed. And there are a couple of things that we saw in the Cannon River watershed in these statewide assessments. There is a chunk of the Cannon River that is considered a water used for production of wild rice. And so we also had some data on that, showed that it was above our standard. So that is going to be listed as impaired for sulfate this year. And then also German Lake in the Cannon River watershed. We had some new data that came in about fish tissue and mercury in German Lake. So you'll see off on your left-hand side is that arrow for German Lake, and off on your right-hand side is that circle and that arrow showing the chunk of the Cannon River watershed. And you'll notice on these slides that there's these AUID numbers. And if you are on the Impaired Waters List website, there is a map where you can plug in those AUID numbers and it'll take you straight to that segment. So you can look in more detail there. All right, last one for the statewide assessment is we have the Iowa River or Upper Iowa River watershed. And there is a macroinvertebrate bioassessment that is newly listed as impaired. And you might be asking, oh, well, that isn't a statewide assessment. That's, one of our aquatic life assessments. Well, that had to do with some of what Emily was talking about, recategorizing streams as cold water or warm water. And so that's why that was redesignated from warm water to cold water. And because of that change, we re-looked at some of those pieces of data and showed that, oh, we're not seeing the type of bugs that we would expect to see in that cold water stream. So that's why that is listed. Okay, so next up, let's talk about some of the delistings or some of the impairments that are being removed from the impaired waters list. So we went through and talked about, okay, here's when we're evaluating all of our data, here's some of the new things we're seeing. Here are some of the new things we're seeing that's really encouraging, that we are seeing new data that's come in that is showing, oh, these water bodies are now meeting those standards. So Beaver Creek for macroinvertebrates, Pleasant Valley Creek for fish, that chunk of the Whitewater River for fish, and then La Crescent Pine Creek fish. So we do have, 3 different chunks of creeks that are being delisted for fish and 1 for bugs, which is awesome. So where do we go from here? So once something is put on the impaired waters list, it is then required by the Clean Water Act to write a TMDL. We touched on that a little bit already. A TMDL being, the pollution budget for a water body. How much pollution can enter water from various sources for us to still meet our goals? And so from there, it feeds into some restoration plans. And I'm going to hand this back to Emily. She can talk a little bit more about what that looks like for these watersheds.
Thank you, Leah. So yes, as Leah mentioned, we have this watershed management framework where we start with our monitoring, that purple box that you see in that graphic, and then we move into some of our investigation and report writing at PCA. So we're at the point now in the Mississippi River and in the Crescent watersheds where we're in that green box. I mentioned stressor identification before. This is where our biologists and scientists revisit the watershed and they look specifically at streams that are impaired for fish and bugs. And what their work does is helps us better understand what pollutants or non-pollutants like fish barriers may be driving those impairments. So that work is currently underway in the Winona and La Crescent watersheds. After that is complete, we'll then move into our TMDL and our RAPS report writing. RAPS stands for Watershed Restoration and Protection Strategy, which is just a holistic report talking not only about these impaired waters, but about the waters that are meeting our water quality standards and what can we do to keep those meeting standards, so protecting those waters. So then that work continues into our statewide One Watershed, One Plan program, which this program is active in both the Winona and La Crescent watersheds. Some of the information that MPCA includes in our TMDL and RAPS reports feed into the work plans for One Watershed, One Plan, so that things can be done on the landscape to meet our water quality goals. And then we just keep going in this 10-year cycle. So that is what we can expect for the La Crescent and Winona watersheds. We expect that the TMDL and RAPS reports will be available hopefully sometime around 2025. I'll start drafting them, or at least thinking about what kind of things to put in them late next year. Another thing that I wanted to mention is MPCA's leading Minnesota's Nutrient Reduction Strategy. Now this is a statewide program where we're really looking at nutrient reductions leaving the state. So this feeds into a lot of the information that we put into our TMDL and RAPS reports as well, but we think more holistically across the entire state. So if you hear that term, know that nutrient reduction strategy is for statewide reductions. Our RAPS and TMDLs are more for those stream-specific reductions.
Thanks, Emily. We can go on to the next slide there. So we've talked pretty deeply now about our watershed approach, our statewide approach just a little bit. Let's pivot and move into, okay, you have some information. There's a public comment out. What does that mean? Where do we go from here? So a piece of the impaired waters list requirement from the Clean Water Act is to also have an assessment guidance manual outlining how we do our assessments. What are the standards? What are the data minimums we require in order to consider something as impaired or consider something as being not impaired anymore, as being delisted from taken off the list? And so the list being that wonderful spreadsheet, and the assessment guidance manual is also linked on our website as that PDF document containing all that information. And new this year, we have Appendix H, which lists out all of the waters designated as having the use of producing wild rice. And so when we mentioned, Bear Lake and we mentioned Cannon River, those are in this list in Appendix H of waters used for the production of wild rice. And so this document, as well as the impaired waters list, are both up for public comment. So let's talk more about how you can actually go through and public comment. So our public comment is open now until January 12th. After January 12th, we will be reviewing all of those comments and responding to comments. And then April 1st is our deadline by the Clean Water Act to submit the list and the guidance manual to the US EPA. After that, they will have 30 days to review it and approve it or disapprove it. And that is when it becomes final and replaces that 2022 impaired waters list that you see is also already listed on our website, because that's our currently approved one. This one is still in draft. So during this public comment period, you can comment on the list itself, which also contains Appendix A, that statewide mercury TMDL. And then we're also looking for comments on our guidance manual, specifically in Appendix H. Are there waters that you see that should be on the list? Are there waters that you think shouldn't be on the list? We want to hear about it. So we have a new tool that we're using this year that makes it really easy to comment on the impaired waters list. If you search up the Minnesota Impaired Waters List website, you can see that screenshot there, highlighted in red. Just scroll down and click comment now. It'll pop you over to a different browser where you can type your comment straight in the text box. You can link a letter, you can link photographs, you can link data sheets, you can link any supporting information you have about your comment. And next slide, then once you click submit, you can scroll down and click view comments, and that's how you can confirm that your comment has been submitted. You can see other people's comments there as well. So that is a lot of information. We have a little bit more details of how we did our assessments for statewide in our meeting tomorrow and also next Tuesday. Both of those meetings are the same content. So if you're interested, don't feel like you need to attend both. You can just pick one. And then all of our meetings on, our regional meetings focusing in on that watershed approach have been recorded and can be found on our website. So let's leave you today with some takeaways. It's a lot of information. We will have plenty of time here for questions for you guys. Some takeaways, if you are wondering, what do I need to know out of this, is that Minnesota, with our watershed approach and our statewide approach, we truly monitor more often and in more places than in other states. And so when you're seeing and comparing our impaired waters list to maybe other states' impaired waters list, and you're looking at those maps that show red for impairments, That doesn't necessarily mean that our water is worse off than other states' water. What it really means is we are doing a lot of data collecting and a lot of research to find what pollutants are in our water bodies. And then when we find those pollutants, we're being very transparent and putting them on our impaired waters list, and doing a lot of work towards those TMDLs and towards that restoration efforts. And it's also good to note that it takes time. So as we mentioned, it's just as important to protect our waters and keep them off the list. In seeing this year's list, we have a lot less new impairments that we have in the past. Just as important to keep things off the list as it is to take them off the list, because it takes time for restoration to occur and to have enough data to show that we have improved that water body and to have that water body be delisted. And then just a last note for the mercury bits on aquatic consumption doesn't mean that there's a swimming advisory there, right? So when you think back through, oh, what are our designated uses? That designated use is for eating fish, not for aquatic recreation or swimming. So just remember that when you're looking through that impaired waters list map, when you're seeing things that are red of what is it that's impaired. You kind of have to think through that. All right, that is all of the information that I have for you at this moment. I will leave you with a photo. This is of Beaver Creek. This is one of our success stories, as we mentioned, of some really great restoration work that's been done and is now proposing to be delisted for macroinvertebrates, for those little bugs that live in the water. And there's a cool success story on our website if you're interested in reading more about it. So that QR code will take you to the public comment page, and there is my email there for the impaired waters list as well. Feel free to contact and send any questions my way there too. All right, Hannah, we are ready to take some questions.
Great. Thanks, Leya. Folks, just as a reminder, you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen if you have a question, and we will call on folks and start to take some questions and comments from the public. Yep. First question from Carly Griffith. Feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you both. This is Carly Griffith. I apologize if I missed this earlier in the presentation, but what is the stream that was listed as impaired for drinking water because of nitrate? Could you remind me of what water body that was?
Yeah, I guess, Emily, if you want to, you can jump in. Let me know if I miss anything. It's a really small chunk of Trout Brook, which the remainder of Trout Brook is already listed as being impaired for nitrate and has an approved TMDL. And so that little chunk we need to transfer as, you know, it already has an approved TMDL essentially. It's like a less than a half mile in length. We have a lot of data that came in on that particular chunk of the stream. So we're kind of, you know, cleaning that up and helping to list that entire chunk.
Thank you.
If I could also add that, you know, we've seen situations like this before where we have smaller tributaries that are added to the impaired waters list for larger streams or rivers that are already listed for nitrate. And that's not necessarily an indication of the nitrate problem getting worse or expanding, but rather it's an indication of MPCA water quality monitoring finally being able to get a large enough data set in order to make an assessment, because we have data minimums that are required in order for us to actually do an assessment. So I just want to remind folks of that, and also say that in this area we have really active watershed partners that have spent a lot of time and money addressing that nitrate issue. So we're all keeping our eyes close to this water body, and we'll be excited to see some of the positive changes that that group makes.
Great. Thank you both. If anyone else has a question, please just use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the screen. You can also, if you think of a question afterwards, we encourage you to write down that email address on the screen, impaired.waters.mpca@state.mn.us. You can send any follow-up questions there. It'll go right to Leya, so we'll be able to get back to you that way as well.
And that website's also listed on our Impaired Waters List webpage, so, or that email address, I should say.
You can also use the QR code at the bottom to go to the Smart Comment page.
We've got some shy folks. I know people have questions.
Okay, well, we will do a last call. Last call for any other questions. Otherwise, we will wrap it up for today. Okay, great. We'll see none. We will conclude today's call, but we appreciate everyone taking the time today to learn a little bit more about this year's Impaired Waters List. We look forward to seeing your comments come through and possibly seeing you at our next public meeting, which is tomorrow at the same time, 11 a.m. on those statewide topics. So with that, we will go ahead and end the meeting, but thank you everyone for your time today.